Меня зовут Вадим Соловьев, я работаю в Позитиве.
Hi, I'm Vadim Solovyev. I work for Positive Technologies.
Об уязвимостях, которые находят...
My team informs vendors of the vulnerabilities found by our researchers.
Еще не забыли, что в прошлом году в апреле на нашу
Now, you may remember that April last year, our company was slapped with American sanctions, and this has resulted in some changes in how we inform the vendors.
Опытные, когда к ним приходят.
Moreover, some vendors really don't have much experience in terms of talking to researchers who want to tell them about their vulnerabilities and even suggest ways of overcoming them. So there may be a host of issues when you're dealing with vendors trying to tell them about their vulns. And you probably understand that with sanctions that have recently been slapped on Russia, it has become even more interesting. So I've got some experience to share with you and some recommendations that may be useful. First thing, let me check if we actually have researchers in audience who are looking for vulnerabilities and reporting them to vendors, be it binaries or web applications or what have you. Raise your hands if you have ever reported vulnerabilities. Okay, good, good.
Всем привет. А есть ли здесь
Hello, everybody. Now let's check if there is more. Like, do we have people on the vendor side?
Их устранения, может быть, те, кто хотели бы узнать, как этот процесс устроен.
Now, do we have people who actually, know how the process works, so to speak?
Ну, скажем так, с натяжкой это по сути тот же самый процесс.
Maybe you're running your own projects and you want to learn more about the bugs, or maybe you have a bug bounty program. Raise your hands if you belong to this crowd.
Меньше, но, как говорится,
not too many, fewer hands than before, but maybe some people are being shy. Now, why am I talking about these two categories? Well, here in the slide, I'm also talking about regulators and CERTs and MITRE. These three groups, they actually know where they stand, what their role is, what kind of information is coming to them, and what kind of information they're going to share with the others. But the researcher and the vendor, if any of them is not really experienced, may easily fail to know what to expect from the other party and what the expectations there are. What kind of information needs to be conveyed, how, and when. When it comes to vulnerability disclosure, naturally, it all starts when the researcher discovers the vulnerability. And this effectively triggers a moral dilemma. On the internet, you can find matrices like this, but effectively there are three options. One is to keep the disclosure in secret. This is what, say, hackers or law enforcement agencies do. They don't tell anybody about it. They abuse it until somebody else discovers and patches it. And full disclosure, the inverse of this.
Когда исследователь нашел уязвимость и сразу ее несет ее в интернет, выкладывает на GitHub, пишет.
This is where you actually talk about it on GitHub, you publish a post, you record a video with POCs. And this is when, cyber criminals and other malicious actors, they grab your POC and they start adapting it for exploitation purposes, and they start attacking companies with it, understanding that the patch is obviously not out yet. At the same time, the vendor sees that the number of attacks is mounting and security corporations are seeing, malware in the wild, exploiting this vulnerability. And the vendor is usually suffering a major hit to their reputation. Naturally, the truth is somewhere in the middle. It could be responsible or coordinated disclosure. The difference between them is not that important, really. It's marginal, but it does exist. In any case, the idea in both cases that the researcher finds a vulnerability and informs the vendor about it, and the vendor analyzes it and goes about patching it, but the researcher keeps his mouth shut. until a fix is released.
Про ответственное раскрытие сказал, как это выглядит в нашем исполнении. Ну, вот это некоторые рекомендации.
So, what does responsible disclosure look like when we do it? And this would be in our case. So, if you are considering doing bug hunting,
в какой-то момент времени сдать уязвимость вендору и сделать это
or,
правильно.
if you want to communicate a vulnerability to a vendor in a morally upright, in a responsible way, this is what you need to do. Well, first, you need to get in touch with the vendor, right? If the vendor is mature, now very often you can actually find a vulnerability disclosure policy on their website.
Дается четкий алгоритм.
So, on a page like this, you will find a specific set of instructions. Who to get in touch with, what kind of report to provide, what the stages are, what the deadlines are. If the vendor is not mature, probably there won't be any policy like this. And the question arises, how do you report it to them? Well, first, you need to find their contact details. So get in touch with them, you notify them. I actually suggest that at the same time, you inform the Russian regulator. Why this is the case, I should tell you a bit later.
После того, как вы уведомили вендора и регулятора, тут уже наступает этап передачи.
So once you have informed the vendor and the regulator, there is this whole issue of sending a report in, should you encrypt it or not. It may happen that the vendor will not understand your report in single go, and they may ask you for a demo, and you may want to stay in touch with them. It's pretty easy to get confused in this soup of text and screenshots. And after the patch is released, the vendor will probably issue an ID for the vulnerability. This is done automatically by Russian regulators. And after that, you may want to present at a conference, talk about your research, or maybe do a publication. And again, you may want to inform the vendor that you are planning to do that. You can discuss it with them after the fix is released, or you can do it before. I mean, not the presentation itself, but rather your discussion with them. And again, you're expected to stay responsible and keep mum about the vulnerability before it's fixed.
Мы рекомендуем сдавать уязвимости.
So this is how we recommend that you communicate vulnerabilities. But naturally, things can go wrong at pretty much every stage. And I'm going to illustrate it with real-life cases from our own experience.
Самый первый этап связаться с вендором, вообще установить.
So the first stage is when you get in touch with the vendor.
С которым мы столкнулись, это был достаточно опытный европейский вендор.
Now, the particular case is like this. There is this European vendor, quite experienced when it comes to vulnerability management. We found their vulnerability disclosure policy on HackerOne. And it says, if you have American sanctions slapped on you, you are not allowed to talk to us about vulnerabilities. And, it may be a hard blow to a researcher who has been working pretty hard to identify those vulnerabilities in the first place. It's important to remember that, there are human beings working for the vendor. And, you can talk sense into them. So we found the people in charge of product security. We got in touch with them and asked them, if they want to do anything about it. We said, we cannot report it to you using HackerOne, but you have other ideas. We were, prepared to send all the information to them via email, and they said, let us get in touch with you. And 2 hours later, they read it, they edited their policy on HackerOne, they completely removed this paragraph about sanctions. So some vendors are actually flexible enough. They are prepared to change their vulnerability disclosure policy if they see that it benefits them.
Это я рекомендую делать вендорам, если к вам приходит.
So this is my recommendation to vendors. If you have a researcher talking to you and telling you that, there are circumstances, due to which they cannot report their vulnerability, your vulnerability, rather, in the usual way.
На сайте вендора или в политике увидели, что вам
please pay attention. So if you have read this policy and you've realized that for some reason you're not allowed to do it the usual way, still get in touch with the vendor. All the good vendors will want to make their products more secure and thus take better care of their users. Actually, what can also happen is that the vendor is not large and many people may be using their product, and that would be actually the next case I'm gonna tell you about, but they won't have vulnerability disclosure policy. But you still want to contact them, right? So with this particular Japanese vendor, we've been trying to find their contacts for a long time. It's an open source product. It's available on GitHub, but we couldn't find their contact details. And it was a significant vulnerability. We didn't want to communicate it to the whole market on GitHub. So I had to use some of my OSINT skills, and I was able to find the right person on Twitter. I couldn't send a message to him directly on Twitter, but I found his latest post, and I added a comment there saying, well, I'm such and such, I found a vulnerability in your product, do get in touch. Well, it's Japan, right? Time difference. I get a message during the night. Hello, thank you very much. He added me as a friend so that we could, exchange messages directly. And, the issue was successfully resolved. I mean, the vulnerability was patched. It's, if you like, a trivial case. But there are some useful takeaways for us here. My recommendation to the vendor is that you should probably indicate your contact details for security matters. Ideally, you would want to have a dedicated mailbox. And if you do have a dedicated mailbox, please make sure you check it, okay? And my recommendation to researchers is that, if you have not been able to find a contact of the vendor, well, you can ask your friends who know something about OSINT to help you. Maybe they know how to Google for information. They may want to find, for example, the founder of the company, particularly if it's a small product, coming from, a lone developer, then the founder is the right person to talk to. Very often, you can find the phone number and you can just, call him and tell him, this is no fraud. I'm a security researcher. I want to report this vulnerability. I have been having a hard time finding it otherwise. So imagine you found the contact details. The next step is that you need to inform them of the vulnerability. So here, a different case, I found a vulnerability in a product of an international firm headquartered in Taiwan. I found, a lot of emails that, have words like security in them. We send messages to all of them, Europe, Russia, United States, nobody answered. So maybe they thought, well, we are under sanctions, so we shouldn't really talk to them. But we got a message from this Russian support. They said, we're not interested. We don't care about vulnerabilities. Get lost. I'm thinking, well, maybe they've misunderstood something. So I found a live chat in their ticketing system. I get in touch with the Russian support people. And I get the same kind of response. We are not interested. I'm not even sure if I'm talking to a human being or a robot. So I'm calling their Moscow office. And there, a person takes the phone, says, according to my management, we are not interested. What do I do? Well, if you're a vendor, obviously, never ever do those things, okay? Accept the report, check it out, and decide if it is critical for you or not. Because it may turn out that the vulnerability is critical, and if you turn the researcher down, he will be insulted, and he will publish it. And then, you know what it means. Exploitation, numerous attacks, corporations and users getting targeted, and your reputation as a vendor jumping off the cliff. And also the regulator may be asking you questions and wondering why you have not reacted to the vulnerability report. So in situations like this, my recommendation is to get in touch with the CERT responsible for the same region or the same industry as the vendor. And you should also inform the Russian regulator if you are a Russian company, because together with you, they should be able to design some compensatory measures. So at least, Russian companies should be able to beef up their defenses, even if the vendor is not doing anything. Block the ports or whatever. Now imagine the vendor has accepted the report and is reading it. Like in this case, the vendor has studied the report, and eventually they get back to you and they say, well, it's a serious issue, but we don't know how to address it.
В одной истории нам вендор сказал,
there are actually two cases here. In one case, the vendor told us, this product has been developed by a team that no longer works for us. It's a legacy product. We are developing a new device now, which will be running new firmware. And we are already telling all our clients, do not buy the old stuff. And this vulnerability, will stay in the legacy stuff. Another case started just the same way, but it ended differently. In the second case, we got in touch with the Japanese CERT, and together with the vendor and the CERT, we found a way to compensate for this problem. So we came up with the recommendations for tiered defense. So that was effectively an ICS solution. So we said, well, we at PT have got a solution for that.
На самом деле, не только причина может быть в том, что старая команда
ушла. Now, the reason for something like this can be that the new team doesn't really know the structure of the old product, or alternatively, the product, the old product, may have been developed at a time when information security was not an important concern for this industry. Like for ICS tools, the thinking a long time ago was that, well, at a plant, we control the physical access. Why should we protect it? We are saying now that, in essence, most industrial control systems are linked to the internet, one way or the other. And therefore, external attacks, do get to ICSs. Now we're effectively saying that any pen tester worth his salt will be able to get access to your ICS and trigger the unmentionables.
АСУТП, старая разработка, понятно, что
so ICS, old ICS solution,
скажем так, аспекты производственных процессов предполагают
some technical aspects of your operational processes required usage of a particular protocol which by design was insecure.
А улучшать его невозможно, потому что тогда нарушится
and it's impossible to improve it because otherwise you will lose
ведут к тому, что вендор говорит, ничего не сделаю, но давайте хотя бы мы
compatibility. And a vendor in a situation like this can choose to at least publish recommendations because they cannot patch it. And our recommendation to the researcher in a case like this is to remind the vendor about the user pains. And tell them that, if you are trying to actually solve this problem by selling new devices, this is not user-friendly. This is what Chinese vendors like doing, but unfortunately, Russian vendors also have the same propensity. So you have submitted your report, and the vendor has said, yes, I am going to respond to it. Well, this is a particular case that really struck me. Everything seemed to be okay. We reported it to this particular Chinese vendor.
Зарепортили, они начали разбираться, долго-долго фиксили, там что-то...
So they've been looking at it, they've been trying to fix it for like 3 or 4 months. And then they get in touch with us and they say, everything is great. This vulnerable component, we have fixed it, and the new version is like this.
Мы не знаем как, потому что надо
But we don't really know how to deploy it, because before we deliver it to users, we need to test it, and the testing scope is colossal, and we don't have the resources for that, and we don't really know when it can potentially happen. I mean, both testing and updating. Isn't that weird? Like, they fixed it, but their users are not getting the benefits of it. I'm asking them, well, guys, are you really sort of simulating it? Just like in the previous case. I recommend that you inform the local regulator and the CERT in question, so that at least some companies are protected. And my advice to vendors is, if you're serious about it, make sure that the patch finds its way to the users. Next stage. It has been communicated to the users. What's the next issue? It's a two-partite case. Two Russian vendors, major ones, well-known companies, well-known products, so I'm not going to drop any names. In both cases, we reported vulnerabilities like 10 p.m. and lunchtime next day. They already released fixes. Colossal, isn't it? In the first case, the vendor got back to us with a CVE sometime later. And in the second case, they said, we're not going to share this CVE with you. And I talked to researchers. I asked them, how come? And they told me, well, we did warn you, didn't we? That, they didn't give us CVEs previously either. And I'm asking the vendor, why aren't you giving us a CVE? And they tell me, we actually don't know how to do that. I mean, okay, if you don't know, let me teach you. I tell him, give me your employee, I'll teach him how to get CVEs for your bugs, because this way, you benefit, you have a well-trained employee, we benefit, we have a CV in our name. Well, it took a week-long negotiation at the level of the CEOs, but finally the agreement was reached, and we did it. So after we created a task force, we got the CVE in a week. And, it was done perfectly, advisory and researchers' names were mentioned as many times as they should. My recommendation here, to the vendors at least, is like this. For the vendor, this process ends, when you remove the vulnerability and you deploy the patch, but please remember that for the researcher, the process isn't over. The researcher is waiting for your thank you in the shape, in the form of a CV ID, because they add it to their portfolio and they boast to their friends. With Russian regulators, it's different. They will get back to you with the ID after you've informed them. But, with CVE IDs, you will need to approach MITRE to do that. And I'm telling you all this because this is my raw experience. And you can say, well, as a researcher, I can send a letter to MITRE and ask them for an update. However, you do remember that we are under sanctions now, and MITRE is no longer talking to us. Since April, we've been sending them letters, which never get answered. Now we know that, if we still want to get our CV IDs, we can do it through the vendors. And if the vendors are responsible, it happens seamlessly. They know that they need to publish an advisory and mention the, nice people who actually helped them. Well, Russian vendors may find themselves in a similar situation. And you know what they told me? Please give me an estimate of how many man-hours this whole process is going to take. Well, I am going to teach them as well. because getting CVE IDs is still possible.
ID-шник — это спасибо исследователю.
So an ID, a CVE ID, is a way of thanking the researcher. It will not be seen as a weakness by the market. It will be seen as a strength. Because, this way, as a vendor, you are showing to researchers that you know how to go about vulnerabilities. And like I said, the researchers should not get frustrated or should not, run away crying when they're not giving a CVE ID. Maybe the problem is that the vendor simply doesn't know how to do that. Or you may even want to help the vendor fill the form out. So the whole slide is green now. And green color here denotes the ecstatic state of the researcher when the vendor knows exactly what needs to be done. No issues, no confusion. We had this case with a Japanese vendor. So despite the sanctions, by the way, this Japanese company has been almost happy to work with us.
О чем хотел сказать, что на самом деле вендор здесь опережал нас.
So the point I was trying to make is that the vendor here was sort of ahead of us. We didn't have to ask them for CVE ID or for announcement or whether they were going to mention us in the advisory or not. We've told them about the vulnerability, they got back to us and they told us, okay, we are going to publish this advisory and that advisory and then that date, this advisory. And yes, are all the names we need to mention listed in your report? Good, thank you very much. And about a week before the publication of the patches, they got in touch with the researcher. They said, well, dear researcher, we are going to publish the advisory. Do you want to make any press releases? At the same time, and in the end, they gave us the CVEs. My advice to the vendor in a situation like this may sound like a toast. I certainly wish vendors like this enough energy to maintain such a beautiful, elegant process at the same level. And my advice to the researchers is that they should remember that there are living, breathing human beings working on the other side of the barricades. And they will really love it if you thank them for their great job done. Like if you enjoyed communicating with them about the vulnerabilities, please do not forget to thank them, because not every vendor is like this. So these cases have covered the way we've been reporting on vulnerabilities of the past year and the bottlenecks we experienced. Yes, we are laboring under sanctions, but it's not that horrible, really, as long as it's a single company. When a whole country is under sanctions, that's a slightly different case. I mean, you may be asking yourself, shall I even report it? Now, it may not be obvious to some people. Foreign corporations have left the Russian market. They are no longer supporting their Russian customers. And at the same time, they are claiming that they've preserved their jobs, which is not really the case. They're no longer supporting the software, for example. This is understood not just by us. This is understood by the hacktivists and cyber criminals. So they understand that after a company publicly announces they've left the Russian market, and if after that they publish some advisory that, we have removed a critical vulnerability, a good cyber criminal will realize, okay, it's a shame they found this vulnerability, but Russian customers are not going to get the patch for it. Let's do an exploit. Let's mount attacks against Russian companies. Let's have a field day.
Сейчас до софта дойдем. Тут вопрос про обновление, да? До России не доходит обновление. Как можно...
Chances are, updates and releases will not find their way to Russian users. Sometimes patches can be downloaded. But then, you may be wondering what this patch contains. It may contain some malicious code or some
обновляют свой софт и остаются на тех старых версиях. Собственно,
unadvertised functionality.
История с обновлениями немножко в разных ключах всплывает, если говорить про open source.
So this whole issue with the updates, is slightly different for open source software, because for open source software, you can do code review. So a Russian company will be able to see an update for some open source software, download it, and then run it and audit it using its own infrastructure.
Репортить или не репортить на сегодняшний момент.
I'm, trying to build infrastructure for this discussion of whether Russian companies would want to report vulnerabilities today or not. As a Russian researcher, you should be aware that when you communicate a vulnerability to a foreign vendor, it may result in higher load for the security teams in Russian corporations. At worst, companies can suffer, or even you may suffer as, an end user of, say, logistics or transportation companies or retail companies or government services. For example, if cashiers cash stations stop working at your favorite grocery store. This is a potential outcome of a vulnerability disclosure. So what shall we do? You may be wondering. If you're a Russian researcher, that is.
Во-первых, я на протяжении всего доклада говорил про регулятор.
Throughout my presentation, I've been mentioning the Russian regulator. FSTEC has many functions, one of which is to inform Russian companies of vulnerabilities. So if you have discovered a vulnerability and you are wondering what to do about it going forward,
то в любом случае стоит уведомить нашего регулятора.
In any case, you should inform the Russian regulator, because FSTEC is going to inform Russian companies, and together with you, they will develop recommendations and compensatory measures. So even if you are not going to report, or you are going to report to an international vendor, at least, you've given an opportunity for Russian companies to protect and defend themselves. They will at least know that an update is going to happen one day. And they should be looking forward to it. And by the way, if you decide to stay anonymous to an international vendor, you may want to contribute your report your vulnerability to an international vendor without disclosing your personality. FSTC can actually do that for you.
Все пройдет хорошо. Причем в конце вы автоматом получите ID-шники.
And by the way, this way you will get a BDU ID, which is guaranteed.
Надо забывать про баг-баунти. Те, кто
Please remember the bug bounty programs.
Ищут баги, те, кто знают про HackerOne, сейчас, наверное,
bug hunters, those who know about HackerOne.
Положение, что на самом деле HackerOne сейчас отказался.
They may be thinking that HackerOne has decided not to collaborate with Russian researchers. Moreover, they've stopped the suspended bug bounty programs of Russian corporations, which means that Western bug bounty platforms seem to be inaccessible to Russians at the moment. You probably know that Russian bug bounty programs will be released this year, including a bug bounty program which is part of Standoff 365. There should be a link. Please. Oh, right. So this is the link. Bug bounty programs are designed to bring researchers and vendors together. So they do, coordination and operational support. Which brings me to the end of my presentation, where I would like to summarize by giving recommendations both to vendors and researchers. My key recommendation to vendors is to stay in touch with researchers, because you're risking way too much, If it's a really major vulnerability, well, probably you won't lose your license to operate, but there will be fines and there will be reputational damage. It's a good idea if you're a vendor to develop a vulnerability disclosure policy so that researchers find it easier to get in touch with you.
Чаще всего подготовленный, потому что он ее прочитал.
And in fact, if they have read it, it will be easier for them to submit their report in the format that is most convenient to you. I've mentioned bug bounty, and I've mentioned the IDs as well. And please remember about your users. Even if you cannot, remove the vulnerability, you can at least propose some compensatory measures.
Рекомендации такие, что,
My recommendations to researchers
нужно всегда оставаться ответственным, если вы хотите
start with the claim that, if you want to be a reporter of vulnerabilities, please report responsibly. And full disclosure in most cases should be avoided. Be responsible about your disclosures. At the same time, situation now is very weird. Please note that some of your disclosures may actually mean additional risks to Russian corporations. Again, it's up to you. It's your judgment call. Please be responsible about the decisions you make. Thank you very much.
Готов ответить на ваши вопросы.
Do you have questions?
Спасибо большое за доклад. Два вопроса. Первый.
Thank you very much. Two questions.
Есть ли возможности, кроме встека, уведомить через НКЦКИ и через госсопку?
I'm wondering if we can use other channels like
компенсационных мер. Несколько раз
like the Technical Center for the Critical Information Infrastructure or GOSSOPCA to inform about the vulnerabilities. And my second question, sometimes vendors offer responses which are neither here nor there. They may be technical, but infeasible, or they may be documentary only. In other words, the vendor reacts in a pretty useless manner. So how do we go about it? Do we inform SOCs? Do we publish our own compensatory measure proposals? Thank you for the question. Well, if you inform FSTC, this is never a mistake. This way, you are assured your BDU. If you are actually informing them through NTCC CII, this is another option. But I actually think that working directly with FSTC, that's just more convenient. If you Google for it, you will find a pretty easy step-by-step guide about half a page long. You don't need to submit your POCs. It's pretty simple. Actually, I was surprised. They're very nice people to deal with. Second question.
Компенсационные меры иногда можно делать там
compensatory measures
еще чего-то.
Sometimes involve, for example, port blocking.
Но нужно помнить,
now, the worst-case scenario is just stopping using the particular software. But you can also do tiered defense. And you can do SOCs. And having expertise-based systems, that should also help. So you can have this, combo of different tools that should help you defend against a vulnerability that has not been patched. Thank you for your report. MITRE is usually informed when the vendor has recognized that the vulnerability exists. So when you send a request for a CVID, usually provides a reference to the vendor's response. And MITRE will then give you an ID very quickly because they see the vendor has recognized the vulnerability. Now with BDU, it's different. We start talking to FSTC long before we may engage the vendor, right? At least that's one of the potential scenarios. Now, does it mean that FSTC will then tell us, how we should act? Will they try sort of running the show or not? And my second question is about open source vulnerability disclosures. I understand your question, Sasha. Thank you.
Про первую часть. Как взаимодействовать со стеком? Ну, я так широко тебе сейчас расскажу. Во-первых,
Communication with FSTC.
ты можешь не совсем до того, как уведомил вендор, ты можешь и после уведомить.
You don't have to inform FSTC before you inform the vendor. You can do it after as well.
Единомоментно. Ну, понятно, что ты не можешь параллельно...
Ideally, you would want to inform them at the same time. Well, you don't have to do it in the same second, but doing it, the same day is a sensible idea. It's okay for FSTC to get your message saying that, we have informed the vendor and we just want you to know there is an issue there. And FSTC will tell you, thank you very much for notifying us. What is your recommendation regarding protection? And that's it. They are not trying to, run the show. And it's the same with open source. So you get in touch with FSTC, you say, well, there is this open source product and I've identified this vulnerability. I've not been able to get in touch with the maintainers or the founders. Can you please help me? Or, I've informed them, they promised to fix it. They say it will take them a month or two. The response will be, yes, thank you very much. It's important for them to know that it exists, and they will create an ID for it. And just like with CVEs, the ID will be publicized only after the fix is released. I'm sorry, I don't see you. Under the current conditions, does it happen that, we have identified, say, a vulnerability with Cisco and they don't want to talk to us, and we talk to FSTC, and then, some serious-looking gentleman will be asking us about the details of the vulnerability. Well, if a vulnerability is discovered in Cisco products, I believe they will be happy to talk to you because they want to address it. However, what I predict may happen is that when they publish a patch, they will not make it available to their Russian customers. Please keep that in mind. I'm sorry, I know very little about the way that law enforcement agencies operate. I believe that if you inform FSTC and they publish some compensatory measures, well, this is certainly good. Will they inform other law enforcement agencies? That I don't know.
Добрый день, спасибо за доклад.
Можно паузу?
Hello, thank you very much for your report. I'm sorry, let me very quickly build on what I said. When you inform FSTC, you do not contribute any exploits, right? You just give them the description, that's it. Piggybacking on the previous question, there are some Russian vendors which are using runtime frameworks, international ones. So when we report to Russian companies, they will say, you know what? This particular international vendor would love to fix this issue for us, but they cannot. Because, Russia is in this particular position that it is in. So we will get in touch with FSTEC, tell them that this vulnerability has been found, and this effectively means that, we may err on the side of not reporting to the vendors. If it's an open source solution, I don't see why you wouldn't report it, because with open source software, you can always do code review. There are two key risks when you do reporting. One is how you do not get the updates, particularly if the vendor has officially announced they're leaving Russia. If the vendor has not made an official announcement like this, there is a different risk that, the stuff you get as update will be more than update, that, it will brick your system or will bring it backdoor or something. So I don't really have a recommendation for that. Individual cases need to be, considered on their own merits. Two questions.
Что делать, если вендор начинает тянуть время? Они часто
What do I do if I see that the vendor is dragging their feet? How do I motivate the vendor to stop doing it? The second one sort of continues in the same vein as the previous ones. Naturally, some vendors are available through HackerOne. And it's easier because they publish their policies. But some vendors don't do bug bounty programs. And we can all, remember cases of like Nintendo stalking or even persecuting researchers. I think that only ZDI has, tried going after researchers. What are these legal risks? Like before, how do I assess those risks before I get in touch with the vendor? Like, with Nintendo, the risk would be that, I see a Black Maria in front of my house next day after I report a vulnerability to them.
Сейчас подумаю секунду.
Let me think about your question one.
Вендор затягивает время. Все, вспомнил.
Oh, right. Vendor dragging their feet. Right. I nearly forgot it.
Где-то вот сейчас.
My answer to your question is in this slide.
Время есть у нас? Где я говорил истина, где-то посередине. Вот тут.
Remember, I said that the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Coordinated disclosure. Вот рулят процессами в первом случае исследователь, на самом деле.
With the coordinated disclosure, you are effectively running the process.
Политику, раскрытие уязвимости у вендора.
So, if you find this vulnerability disclosure policy on a vendor's website, and they say, we do believe in coordinated disclosure,
сдавая уязвимость, вписываетесь
and you report this vulnerability to them, you sort of undertake to play by their rules.
отклонитесь от того, что они от вас ждут.
And if you then deviate from their expectations,
пришлют машины за вами. В случае с responsible disclosure,
they may actually go after you.
У меня свои.
I'm sorry, so with coordinated disclosure, it's the company calling the shots. With responsible disclosure, you say, well, I want to disclose it. I am prepared to help you a bit, but I will be calling the shots. And smaller companies are often immature enough. So the way it works is that you tell them, well, I give you time to address this vulnerability. I give you 90 days. If you fail to address it within 90 days, too bad for you. I'll make it public. And this is how you actually motivate the vendor. I understand that there should be some exceptions to this rule, but this is the simple answer. You can also tell them, you know what? There is your CERT, the CERT for your country or your industry. Would you like them to be engaged as well? By the way, we've already sent them a letter. So please be aware that we know you're dragging your feet, and your CERT knows that. And we can easily, forward our email communications to them.
У них свои интересы, свои цели. Потому что в любом случае...
Well, they're also human beings, right? They've got their own interests, they've got their aims. We often think of corporations as, soulless machines, but the reality is that they're staffed by people, and, they often want to protect their assets. They don't want to be flagged or fired for doing shitty code. So you may want to explain to them that this is not bad news, that, we've just told you how you can upgrade your system to the next level, where it will be, less holy. The second question. Well, if you don't want to see a Black Maria in front of your home, well, inform them through platforms where you can do it anonymously, or you can do it through the existing regulators, such as Russian regulator. And if the vendor is okay, you can send them the report, and you don't have to do it through the regulator.
наш регулятор.
So here, the regulator will effectively be a mediator.
Наверное, продолжение первого вопроса. Вопрос такой, ну, наверное, он все пофиксил, он вендор классный.
Now, assume a good vendor has fixed everything, and I want to publish an article. And I tell them, I want to publish this article. And the vendor says, no, you don't. We are not okay with that. What do I do?
Интересный момент. Ну, то есть это вопрос
трудно что-то
про
сказать.
юридическое сопровождение. То есть, вот,
It's
кстати,
effectively a legal question.
есть ли планы какие-то
And this also is a relevant question for the stand of bug bounty. I'm sorry, I'm certainly not so well positioned to take this part of the question. But you should talk to the organizers for sure.
Вадим, привет.
We have like 6 more minutes. Hi, Vadim. It's a great
Круто, что подсветили.
that you're talking about Russian companies. You know, it's sort of not that obvious.
Есть ли разница общения с вендором через площадку или напрямую?
I'm wondering if there is any difference in terms of dealing with the vendor directly or through a particular platform, and what would be more efficient in terms of reporting, I mean.
Экспертный топ самых дотошных вендоров к ПОКам, которые прям докапываются.
Which vendors, in your opinion, are particularly demanding when it comes to provision of POCs?
Про баг-баунти или не про баг-баунти? Ну, смотрите, если компания пришла на баг-баунти площадку, то, очевидно, она хочет, во-первых, разгрузить в части операционки.
Launches a bug bounty program, it shows that they certainly want to reduce their workload, particularly if they're using a bug bounty platform. Well, because there is obviously a lot of admin workload involved. And it's therefore pretty easy to predict what's going to happen for the vendors as well as the researchers. Now, if you're using a bug bounty platform,
те покопали их продукты, и, соответственно, в перспективе
you should be able to retain, more researchers so that, they look more into their products and make them even more secure.
До баг-баунти истории вендор не дошел, я не говорю, это хорошо или плохо, но просто не пришел он туда еще пока.
If a vendor is not present at a bug bounty platform, which may be due to different reasons,
где-то он может. Опять же, тут
it means that all the risks related to researcher communications rest with them. Well, they should start with publishing a vulnerability disclosure policy. For example,
положение баг-баунти площадок, например.
A researcher may be unhappy about particular rules of a given bug bounty platform or whatever.
Тут общение людей. Все сводится к общению людей. И если
you know what? I'll put it differently. It's all about human-to-human communication. Some people get insulted by a meme or a smiley in official communications. Sometimes, the chemistry simply doesn't work. And the end result is that a vulnerability doesn't get patched. I cannot tell you if it's good or not. What I'm trying to say is that approaches may differ. Much really depends on the maturity of a given vendor and the extent to which the vendor will want to attract attention to their products. Now, if they want to be, seen as dramatically different from the rest of the industry, they will probably want to be present at a bug bounty platform.
Второй вопрос, напомни, пожалуйста. Вот.
And your second question? Oh, right. The Chinese vendors tend to demand as many or more POCs than anybody else. It is partially a language issue. Screenshots somehow don't work that much for them. They love videos. And, their English language skills sometimes are not good enough for, just written communications. They do prefer videos. Let's wrap it up, okay?
К какому варианту
Last question.
относится раскрытие Zerodium площадка? Спасибо.
What about Zerodium?
Классика координированного раскрытия.
Well, this is the classic of coordinated disclosure.
Вот внизу. Они там как координатор
They are effectively a coordinator. It's effectively a mixture of bug bounty and coordinated disclosure. I won't go into excruciating detail, but please note, it's also a way of responsible disclosure. Thank you very much. Thanks for your interest. The last slide contained my contact details. If you're interested, please ask me questions on Telegram or contact me via email.